Today's daf is Eruvin daf Kuf Bet. Today's daf is dedicated by Michelle Weiner for Wash Lema for her daughter, Bella Weiner, Bella Rachel Bat Malka Enya. And Hashem should guide the hands of Dr. John K. Petty, the surgeon operating on her today. Good luck. If you haven't signed up for the Siyum yet, now is the time. The Siyum's about to happen. It's just a few days away. Please sign up, register. You can get to it through Hadron's site. There's an event on Facebook. The details are there. Instagram, you can find details everywhere. Please join our Siyum. We have a great program. We're going to deal from a few different directions, both from people from our communities who are learning, also from women scholars. We're going to hear about Eruvin in practice. We hear about how an Eruv was built in South Philadelphia. We're going to have a lot of interesting things. Plus, we're going to learn the last stuff, and we're going to do the Siyum together. So please join us. Please ask others to join, even people who haven't yet joined the learning. Everyone's invited to the Siyum. So please don't miss it. It will be a great event. We're going to start now. And also, we're looking for sponsors. If somebody wants to sponsor Masechet Psachim, we don't yet have a sponsor for the Masechet. So if you're interested in sponsoring the Masechet Psachim, please go into the website and follow the instructions there. So we're going to start now with the Mishnah at the bottom of Kuf Aleph Amud Bet. Neger sheyesh b'rosho glustera. If you have a bolt. Okay, we're now going to talk about bolts. I don't know if you remember, but when we ended Masechet Shabbat, we had a whole bunch of different issues about building tents and also with bolts. And it's very interesting that both Masechtot end with similar topics. So if you have a bolt that has yesh b'rosho glustera, it's unclear exactly what this glustera is. We'll give you just a few of the many interpretations that there are. Could be it's a bolt at the bottom of the door. It could be a bar that's inserted into rings that holds two doors together. It could be, this is what Rashi says, that there's a thick part of it on one side, thicker than on the other side. And the thick part is something that could be used potentially for pounding. Okay, so we're going to go with that interpretation and explain why that makes a difference. Rabbi Eliezer osel, the Rabbi Yossi matir. So Rabbi Eliezer says it's forbidden to put this bolt into the wall because it looks like you're putting a peg in the wall, and putting a peg in a wall would be forbidden because of building on Shabbat, and therefore this looks like that. Rabbi Yossi matil, Rabbi Yossi says no. If you're putting a regular bolt in a door, yes, but this is a glustera, which means, again, according to Rashi, it has a thicker part, and that thicker part can be used for pounding, like a mortar and pestle, so it's the part that you pound with, the pestle. Because of that, this is what we call a utensil. Once we call it a utensil, will you build with something that's called a utensil? No, you really wouldn't do that. You wouldn't take something that could be used for something else and stick it as a peg in a wall. You put a peg in a wall, you put a peg in a wall, not something that could be used as a kli. So the fact that it's a kli allows us to put it as a bolt in the wall because then it doesn't look like you're building. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, Maaseh b'knesset sheb'Tveria. There was a case in a shul in Tveria. Shayu noagim bo heter. They would allow this. Now remember, Rabbi Eliezer says it's forbidden. So he says, look, I'm going to prove to you from this case in Tveria. First, they thought it was okay, and then they changed their minds and they said it's not. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Isor nahagubo, uba Rabban Gamliel vaskenim v'itiru lan. So Rabbi Yossi says, no, in fact, this was Isor nahagubo, it was forbidden. And Rabban Gamliel and the Zkenim came and they permitted it. In other words, you got the facts all wrong. It was really actually the reverse. So now comes the Gemara, and the Gemara says, "B'nital ba'ogdo kuli amalu pligi." When it comes to a case where this bolt was hanging by a rope, okay, now we're going to assume, even though it didn't say so in the Mishnah, that we're talking about a bolt that hangs from the door by a bolt, okay, by a rope. So if it's hanging, okay, b'nital ba'ogdo, that if it's with a thick, heavy rope, that it's not going to fall very easily. Nobody disagrees. Everybody says you can do it with this. You can use it to lock the door. Because why? Once it's hanging, if you remember, we had pokakin in the end of Masechet Shabbat, where you had it hanging from the window, the thing that closed up the window. If it was hanging, then it was okay. So it's obvious then that you're using it as a vault because it's hanging there. It's not used for building. If it's not going, if the rope is very thin and it could potentially break, then that's where they debate. Temar savar kevan diesh borosho glustera torat kli alav. Umar savar kevan de'eno nital b'ogdo lo. One says, look, it's got torat kli alav, so it doesn't really matter that whether it's tied to the rope strongly or not, and therefore it's going to be allowed. That's Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Eliezer says, no, since it's not nital b'ogdo, it's going to fall. It's very loose. No, we're not going to say that this is okay. And therefore, we're still going to worry that it looks like you're building. Before we move on to the next Mishnah, I want to mention something that came up the other day. My battery was running out, and I kind of rushed through the end of class. I forgot yesterday to mention it, but I wanted to go back to that interesting sugya on Daf. It was on Kuf, Daf Kuf. Okay, we had two things that we talked about that I kind of rushed through that I wanted to just talk about. First, we started with the topic of kol hakofesh tolid var mitzvah, right? If you force your wife, that you're not, basically we saw that you're not allowed to force your wife to have intercourse if she's not interested. And I said at the time that it showed a very big insight on the part of the rabbis that they understood how important this issue was. And I just wanted to point out that some people say that this is what we call in law now spousal rape, which is something that only in recent years did that become the legal systems, let's say the American legal system and even the Israeli Supreme Court also ruled, I believe it was in 1980, that this is actually called rape, right? Originally they thought, oh, only if you rape someone who's not your wife, it's considered rape, but it now became part of law, both in Israeli law, American law, and I'm sure in other countries as well, that this could be called spousal rape. Whether they mean to go so far and to say, right, how exactly one defines spousal rape obviously is a question, but it seems like the rabbis are potentially discussing something which is also found in law, which is defined as actually rape. Okay, that's number one. And number two, there was this other issue about that the husband who makes his wife, right, naseit kar leba'ala, one of the curses are that she becomes a pillow for her husband, because during relations, the husband is on top and the woman is at the bottom. I was rushing through. I wanted to just point out something very important, which is, even though this is the recommended practice in Jewish law, it's not the only option within Jewish law, and that there's room also for the opposite to be the case. And some say maybe not on a regular basis. There's all different opinions about it, but it's maybe recommended, but it's not necessarily the only opinion that there is. Okay, important that I wanted to just go back to that. Now I want to move on to the next Mishnah, back to more technical laws relating to locks and opening doors and what one can do on Shabbat or not. Okay, neger hanigral. If you have a bolt that's dragging on the floor, noalim bo b'mikdash avalo b'medina. Again, what does it mean it's dragging on the floor? It means it's attached to a rope, but it's not hanging. If you remember when we talked about the pokakin sugya, about putting a block, in that window to block in the window, like a wooden piece that fits into the window, because remember, they didn't have glass in those days in the windows. So if you had a piece like that, it was hanging, and we distinguish there between hanging in midair or what if it's on the floor. So here also we're going to discuss the same thing. If you have a bolt that's nigrar, dragging on the floor, noalim bo b'mikdash avalo b'medina. We're going to start now a slew of Mishnayot, which distinguish between, and that's because of this Mishnah, distinguish between things that can be done in the Beit HaMikdash, because in the Beit HaMikdash, you're allowed to do things that are forbidden by rabbinic law, not by Torah law, but by rabbinic law. But you can't necessarily do those same things out of the Mikdash. So the Medina is outside the temple. So neger hanigral, noalim bo b'mikdash avalo b'medina. So we're now going to assume that if it's hanging, then you're allowed to do it in the temple, because it's only forbidden by rabbinic law, because it looks like you're building. Avalo b'medina, but you can't do it outside the temple. V'hamunach, but if it's resting on the ground and not attached, kan v'kan asur. Then it's going to be forbidden in both places, because that's, again, boneh, building. Rabbi Yehuda omer, hamunach mutar b'mikdash v'hanigrar b'medina. So Rabbi Yehuda says, no, if it's resting on the ground, then it's mutar in the mikdash, but not in the Medina. In other words, where the first opinion said it's forbidden in both places, he says, no. It's allowed. It's only, any of these cases are only by rabbinic law, and therefore it's going to be allowed in the mikdash and the nigral. If it's attached by a string and dragging on the floor, that's going to be allowed even outside the temple. That's not even going to be forbidden by rabbinic law. So Rabbi Yehuda is more lenient on both, in both cases. He jumps it down a level. Tanu Rabbanan. Now the Braita says, Ezehu neger hanigrar. Now we're going to have a Braita that says something very similar. Ezehu neger hanigrar shenoalim b'mikdash avalo b'medina. What's the type of bolt that you can use in the temple, but not in the Medina, not outside the temple? This is defining exactly what we said, which is if it's hanging and it's attached by a string and it's hanging, and one side gets down to the ground, that's called neger hanigrar. That which neger hanigrar, again, according to Tanakama, the one that we're going to say you can do in the temple, but not in the outside the temple. Rabbi Yehuda omer, this kind is even allowed outside the temple, as we said before. So what's the case where it can't be done outside the temple? It's not tied and it's not hanging, and it's off to the side in the corner. That's something that you can't do. That's what we talked about, munach in our Mishnah. So it's basically the same thing. Amar Rav Yehuda, it's just worded a little bit differently. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel halacha ke Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda, we're more lenient. Benigral, okay? In the nigrar case, we can paskin like Rabbi Yehuda, presumably we paskin like him in both. Amar Rava, v'hu shekashor b'delet, says, but only if it's tied to the door, okay? It has to be tied to the door. So now the Gemara says, Ini, is that really true? That has to be tied specifically to the door? Right? Meaning it can't be tied to, let's say, the door post. Okay, it has to be tied to the door. So really, is that true? Says, wait. He says Rabbi Tavla went to Mechoza and he saw that there was a bolt that was hanging on the Ivra Dadasha, on the doorpost. Velo Amaluhu Velo Midi, and he didn't tell them anything. Meaning they used this. They used it as a bolt, and he didn't stop them. So the answer. This was attached by a very heavy rope. So if it's attached by a very heavy rope, then again, okay, so now we're distinguishing. It's attached by a heavy, this goes back to what we saw in the previous Mishnah. If it's attached by a heavy rope, even if it's attached to the doorpost, it's okay. If it's attached to the doorpost by not a heavy rope, then it's not going to be okay. Rav Avia ikla l'nehardea. Another case. He came to the Hardea. He saw that he had tied it with a reed. Amar dan lo nitrok. He said, this isn't going to be sufficient at all because a reed, now, whether you say this is like a noni talbogdo, or maybe this is even less than that, it's not even a rope. There it was a weak rope. A reed is not even really a rope at all. He said, I can't lock the door with this, or nobody can lock the door with this. By Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera now asks, Nikmaz Mahu. What is Nikmaz? So we're going to see. Nikmaz seems to be if you put it in a hole in the floor. Okay. Now it seems that they're discussing, let's say, we know that there's locks, right, where it goes, there's a bolt that comes out on the side horizontally, and there's also a bolt that goes vertically down into the floor. But what they seem to be discussing here is when you're making a hole in the floor where there's not actually a hole, or there's not a big enough hole. And as you're putting it in, it basically goes down and makes a bigger hole in the floor. So he asks, is one allowed to put in a bolt in that way? Amar Rav Yosef, Maiti Baile, what's he asking? Lo Shmiele, doesn't he know? Haditanya, the fact that it appears in a Braita. Nishmat Asul, Nikmaz Mutal. Okay, first it says, if it's Nishmat, if it comes... if it's nishmat, if the rope rips, okay, the rope tears, then it's forbidden, but nikmaz is allowed, okay, but if you're bolting it down into the floor, it's allowed. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, nikmaz alfa pisha eno nishmat asur. Nikmaz, even if it's not detached, it didn't fall off of anything, is going to be forbidden. So we have a machlokah Rabbi Yehuda Tanakama. Va'amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. And Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, halacha ke Rabbi Yehuda, we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. B'nikmaz. Okay, so therefore, why are you asking this question? V'tama mai, what's the reason? Amar Abaye, mishum demechse keboneh. Imagine you're putting this peg into the ground and you're making a hole in the ground. That pretty much looks like you're building. So, Ba'amine Rav Nechumi bar Zachariah me Abaye. A different question. Asalo beit yad mahu. What if the bolt had a handle? Amar le, buchna kamart. Isn't this no different than the buchna, than the mortar that we talked about, than the pestle that we talked about before that they would use to crush, right? To crush the stuff. It's like it's got a piece sticking out. So then we said that makes it a utensil. If it's a utensil, Rabbi Yossi said it's okay. Itmar, and also it was said, Amar Rav Nechumi bar Ada, Salo beit yad mutar, and it was said explicitly that if you have it beit yad, then it's allowed. Hayi sharita dehave be Rabbi Pedat. There was a beam that was in the house of Rabbi Pedat. Again, we keep seeing all different situations that happened. To have a midlei be asara. There were now the assumption right now. Again, this is at least the interpretation that Rashi goes by, which is that now we're leaving the topic of boneh, doing similar things, but we're out of boneh now. The issue here is muktzah. Okay, we started with locks and how to close doors. We're now going to talk about other ways of locking up doors. Right? There's two ways you could lock a door. You could, if you don't want to prevent someone from coming in, you could put a bolt in, but you can also push something up against the door and then no one can open the door. It's another method. And here the issue wouldn't be building because you're clearly not putting anything permanent in the wall. You're just propping something up against the wall. But the issue might be muktzah because you're propping up something very heavy, and maybe something very heavy would be muktzah. So there was a beam that was in the house of Rabbi Pedat. It took 10 people to move it. And they pushed it up against the door. And he didn't stop them. Amar Torat Kli said, this is a kli, it's a utensil. So what that it's super heavy? That doesn't make it muktzah. It's a utensil. Once something's a utensil, then right, anything that, remember, muktzah means something that can't be used at all for anything really. So something that's not usable is not a utensil. This is a utensil. Once it's a utensil, you can move it. Another case, Hahi Asita. There was a mortar. Okay, you can even look at Rashi. It's funny. He says mortar. Okay, mortire. Okay, so obviously it comes from the same language, right? He usually uses Old French in his when he uses words that are loazi, they're called the loazei Rashi, are from Old French. So you had nasita, a mortar, to have a bay marshmul. It was in the house of marshmul. To have a machzeket adrifa. It held a half a core, okay, which is a lot. Okay, it's I checked up the measurements. It's 124 to 216 liters, right? Depending on there's always debates about these measurements, or 34 to 60 gallons. Okay, so you had something that obviously the mortar fit a lot in it, which means it was very heavy. Shara Mar Shmuel and Mishdi Adasha. So again, he allowed this to be pushed up against the door. Amar Torat Kli Ale. Okay, he said this is a utensil, so again, it's allowed. Shalach Rami Bar Yecheskel Rav Amra. Namely, Mar Mahalim Milima Al Yata de Amar La Mishmei Rav Asi. Tell me something interesting that you learned, right? Tell me some of the things that you learned from Rav Asi. The Kipi de Arba. Okay, I want to hear about the Kipi de Arba, okay, which are these bars that went over the boat, okay, and then people would hang things over this area. So now we're getting back to building, and the issue here is a different issue of building, which is building a tent. So the question is, are you allowed to put something over it? Shalach le, hachi amar Rav Asi, hani kifi de'arba b'zman sheyesh be'en tefach, if the thickness is a tefach, a handbreadth, inami ein behem tefach, or it doesn't have a tefach, but ein bein zel shlosha, but there's not more than 3 in between each one, lemachar mevi machzelet upores alehem. The following day, you can bring a machzelet, you can bring a mat and put it over. Okay, my time up, mosif al ohel harayu. Okay, the reason you can do this is because this is already an ohel and you just want to add to it. Okay, there's a very big law in building tents, okay, for example, baby carriages. Since a baby carriage has an awning, right, or the shade, that even when it's open, it still has a tefach. So when you close it, you're just finishing. It's mosif on an oel or an awning. Okay, these are all relevant halachot that come out of this. V'shapir dami, okay, and therefore it's okay. Hanu dichre, there were rams, Dahavule Rav Huna, Debiba Mama Bau Tula, Ubalaya Bau Avira. During the day, they needed shade, and at night, they needed air. So the question is, how would they be able to take off some sort of covering and put it back on during the day? Okay, go take the mat, throw it over, and just leave a tefach, okay? Leave a tefach when you open it, leave a tefach, and again, that will be allowed. Again, lemachar pashtu mosif alo alarayu v'shapir dami. Right? So again, it's just adding to a tent, right? To a temporary tent, and therefore it's okay. Amarav mishum Rabbi Chia, v'lo mutar l'toto mutar l'parko b'Shabbat. If you have shade, so shade is not, it's not an oel, it's not a tent, it doesn't go over you, and therefore you can take it off and you can put it back on Shabbat. Kilat chatanim, what about a canopy that they use for weddings? Mutar leporkal lenatota b'Shabbat. Okay, the kilat chatanim, I'll show you a picture. Looks like this. Okay, by the way, I forgot to show you the picture of the neger hanigral, neger hamunach, and kashur v'taloi, where it's hanging. Okay, so one is right, nigrar is on the ground, munach is just standing on the side, it's not attached at all, right? The nigrar has a string, and the kashur v'taloi is hanging there up in midair. Okay, now if we look at kilat chatanim, this is the shape. It's basically, it's like a square at the bottom. I'm going to describe it for those who can't see, or a rectangle actually at the bottom base. Then it's like a bed, okay? It's a canopy bed. Then you have two bars with a bar coming up from the sides of the bed with one bar on the top. Okay, it's not a canopy with like a square at the top, but it's got one bar across the top, and then coming down from there is the canopy. So it goes in an upside down V shape. So kilat chatanim mutar leporkar lenatota b'Shabbat. You're allowed to put it up and take it down, meaning you could throw that sheet over it, okay, or take it down on Shabbat. Amar of Sheshet Bered Rav Idi, but now we're going to have all sorts of qualifications. Lo amaran ela she'en b'gagat tefach, as long as you don't have a tefach on the roof, right? This just has a beam across the roof, but the beam isn't a tefach. If it was a tefach width, then already you're building a tent because it has a roof. Aval yesh b'gagat tefach asur. If it's a tefach, it's forbidden. V'chi ein b'gagat tefach, and when it says if it's not a tefach, it's okay. That's only if lo amaran ela she'en b'pachot mishlosha samuch l'gag tefach. It's not just that the top doesn't have a tefach, but as it widens, as it goes down, if you count 3 tefachim underneath, which again, 3 tefachim is lavud, it's as if it's at the top, you also can't have a tefach at that 3 tefachim down from the top. So meaning the top can't be a tefach, and with up to 3 tefachim underneath that, also can't have a tefach of width between both sides of this sheet now that it's draped over it. So if you had a tefach at that height of within 3 of the top, it would already also be considered a tent. If it did have, it would be forbidden. One more thing. Also, we're talking about when we're going to say it's allowed is when the bottom part doesn't have more than a tefach on either side. Okay, meaning basically the bed is only 2 tefachim wide. But if it's wider than 2, then already we're going to say even if the top doesn't have a tefach or 3 below doesn't have a tefach, still this is wide enough that this is basically considered an oel, kind of like a teepee, right? The top of a teepee has it comes to a point, doesn't have a tefach of width at the top necessarily, but it is called a tent because it goes out, right? And therefore it's a tent. But Amar of Shisha Bered Rav Idi, Sayana Share. Okay, Sayana is a hat made of felt. You can go out with it on Shabbat. Okay, why wouldn't you be? Well, why wouldn't you? We'll see in a minute. V'hatanya asur, but isn't it forbidden? And they assume, why is it forbidden? Because a hat has a rim. Now, if a hat has a rim, what's the issue? The issue is that you're basically having an OL. What's it doing? It's protecting you, right? It's blocking things off. So that's like a tent, a temporary tent. So they say, lo kashya de ipe tefach had de lepe tefach. Say, it just depends whether your hat, the rim is a tefach or not. If it's a tefach, it's pro, less it's not. So that's how we resolve both those sources. Element. Now you're probably wondering, what do you mean? I can't go out with a hat on a rim on Shabbat? I'm building a tent by putting a hat on, right? All these women wearing nice, beautiful hats to shul with big rims. How could that be? Brims. Anyway, we'll see in a minute why. What if, by the way, we learned this already in Masechet Shabbat. What if I put a cloak over my head and I just drape it over my head? What? That's going to be a problem because I'm making like a tent there. So elalok, and that it can't possibly be. They say elalok kashya had mihadek hadelo mahadek. The issue is actually something totally different when it comes to hats. The issue is that it might blow off, and therefore, if it's going to blow off, okay, meaning it's loose on your head, then it's going to be a problem. If it's not loose on your head, then it's okay. What's the issue with blowing off? If your hat blows off, right? Imagine this actually is more common with men in kippot. When their kippah blows, I was just my grandmother's funeral the other day, and my uncle's kippah, it was very windy and it just blew off. And luckily we caught it, but right, you can imagine something like that happening. Now, what happens when that happens? You immediately go pick it up. And if it's Shabbat, you might carry it 4 cubits in the public domain, and that's forbidden. So therefore, they don't want people wearing hats that could easily blow off. New Mishnah. If you have a hinge and the hinge comes off, so the bottom hinge is not as important as the top hinge, we're going to see. Because the bottom hinge, you could still kind of function with, this is either for a door, or really they say we're talking about, and this is based on the Braita, we're going to see in a minute, that it seems to be a door, a hinge of a closet or box or of sorts. So you can put the bottom hinge back, b'mikdash, avalo b'medina, in the temple, but not outside the temple, meaning it's forbidden only by rabbinic law, and therefore it's allowed in the temple. V'ha'elyon kan v'kan asur. But the top one, because once the top one comes off, the whole thing kind of falls off. Then by you fixing it, it's more like you're building, and that's going to be forbidden even in the mikdash. Rabbi Yehuda says the upper one in the temple and the lower one is allowed even in the Medina outside the temple. Okay, again, he's more lenient, one level, right? He moves everything a level. Tanu Rabbanan. So now the rabbis say, and by the way, the concern of the bottom one, okay, why is it only to Rabbanan? Because we're worried the top one, you're really putting it in its place. That's fixing it. Otherwise, it's not going to function. The bottom one, we're worried that you might hammer it in too well, and then that will be building. Tano Rabbanan, Sir Delet Shida Teval Umigdal. This is where I said where the Braita is going to say the hinge of a door or a chest or some sort of box or closet or a tower. B'mikdash machzirin b'medina dochakim. So in the mikdash you can return it to its place, and in the Medina outside the temple dochakim you can push it into place, but you can't really fix it. V'ha'elyon kan v'kan lo yachzir. But the upper one, no matter what, you can't return, right? Whether you're in the mikdash or in the Medina, gzera shema yitaka, because we're worried maybe you'll hammer it in. V'im taka chayav chatat. And if you were to do that, you'd be obligated from Torah law. Shel bor v'shel v'shel yitzia. But if it's a pit or a ditch or a yitzia or some added area to your house, lo yachzir v'im yachzir chayav chatat. You can't return it all. And if you did, you'd be obligated a korban chatat. And that's because these are attached to the ground, because the other things weren't attached to the ground, and therefore it's only by rabbinic law. These are not attached to the ground, and therefore by building them, by doing this, you're actually obligated by Torah law. Machzirin ritia b'Shabbat, new Mishnah. You can return a bandage on Shabbat. And remember, talked about you can't, there's two issues here. Number one, refuah, medicinal purposes. We're assuming that your bandage has cream on it, like an ointment. So you can't put it on Shabbat because it's a malacha of mimachek. You might come to smooth it on your skin. So let's say, now why are you taking this off in the mikdash? Well, what they're saying is that if you take it off in the temple, because you're not allowed to have any sort of barrier between your hands and what you're doing. So because of that, people would take their bandages off. Otherwise, the chatzitza, your hands have to be doing the work directly if you're a Kohen and you're working in the temple. So if you take off your bandage, you're allowed to put it back on, because taking it off actually helps you to do the work you have to do in the temple. But not outside, because that's going to be a problem. You might come to smooth your skin out by putting the bandage back on if it still has ointment on there. Im b'tchila kan v'kan asur. But if you're putting on a bandage, you didn't have a bandage on in the first place, and now you want to put it on, it's going to be forbidden anywhere, because there we're worried shema yimachek. And the issue, why in the temple, is only a derabanan, but we don't allow it in the temple because we don't allow any prohibition that's rabbinic in nature to be done in the temple. We only allow things that have effect on work you're doing in the temple. This has no connection to anything you're doing in the temple. This is just, well, I want to put a bandage on. I happen to be in the temple. The other one was we allowed you to put it back on, because if we don't allow you to take it, if we don't allow you to put it back on, you might not take it off. And if you don't take it off, well, then you're going to have a chatzitza, a barrier between you and the work, because there's something on your hand. So therefore, we want to make sure that you take it off, so we allow you to put it back on. So that connects with work in the temple, whereas putting on a bandage has nothing to do with the temple. We don't allow you to do that. Tanu Rabbanan. And if it's just for medicinal purposes, by the way, that's a separate thing. That's because we're worried you might come to grind up some of the herbs for medicine, and that's why any kind of medicines are problematic. Also, d'Rabbanan. Tanu Rabbanan. If you have a bandage that fell off, you're allowed to put it back on Shabbat, just like we saw in the Mishnah. Now we're going to see another opinion. Our Mishnah said you can only do it in the temple. This seems to say you could do it anywhere. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, this time Rabbi Yehuda is more stringent. If it went down, you can push it up. If your bandage moved up, you can push your bandage down. You can undo a little bit of it. Wash the wound underneath. And then you cover it up, and then you uncover the other part. You wash it, and then you put it back on, basically. So you can either move it up or down, or pick up one side, wash underneath, put it back, pick up the other side. You can do that. But but you can't wash the bandage itself, because by doing that, you're going to end up smoothing out, right? Putting the ointment on your skin. And if you're to do that, you'll be obligated by Torah law. So therefore, we don't allow that. I assume, it's not 100% clear to me what they mean, but I assume what they mean is if you want to wash your bandage while it's on you, then it's going to cause the ointment to be rubbed into your skin. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, halacha ke Rabbi Yehuda. So he says we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. But Amar Rav Chisda lo shanu ela shepirsha al gabei kli. He says, wait, Rabbi Yehuda says you can't put it back on, right? Once you take it off, you can't put it back on. So now they're going to say, well, according to Rav Chisda, he only said that ela shepirsha al gabei kli. It depends what you did with it when you took it off. If you put it on a utensil, then Rabbi Yehuda says no, and Tanakama says you can put it back on. Aval pirshal gabe karka, but once you put it on the ground, divrei hakol asul. Once you put it on the ground already, then if you start to put that bandage on, it's as if you're putting it on from the beginning, as if it was never on your body to begin with. This, by the way, sounds very similar to something we learned at the very beginning of Masechet Shabbat about returning a pot to the plata, right, to the fire. Can you return it? What if you took it off and you put it down on the ground? What if you put it down somewhere not on the ground? And we made this distinction between still holding it in your hand or having put it all the way on the ground. This whole distinction there sounds very similar. So according to Rav Chisda, everyone agrees that if you put it on the ground, you can't put it back on. And the machloka between them is if you put it on a utensil. And then Rabbi Yehuda doesn't allow it in any case. But Tanakama says it's okay. Amar bar Rav Ashi, so Mar, the son of Rav Ashi, says, I was in front of my father, Rav Ashi, nafla lea besadya, and his bandage fell off onto a pillow. V'kamahadrle, and he put it back on. Aminale, I said to him, "Savar lamar lahadam Rav Chisda machloket shepershal gabe kli avar pershal gabe karka asur." Don't you agree with what Rav Chisda said? That if you put it on the ground, it's forbidden, but if you put it on a utensil, there's a debate. And Amar Shmuel, halacha ke Rabbi Yehuda, but Shmuel said we pass like Rabbi Yehuda, who said you can't return it anyway. So Amar li, lo shmi'a li. Rav Ashi said, didn't hear that, which means they say, Klomar lo sfira li. I don't hold by what Rav Chisda said. I disagree. I think they argue about when you put it on the ground, but everyone agrees if you put it on a utensil, then you're allowed to put it back on because it hasn't really been off you really. Only once you put it on the ground, it's as if you're not planning to put it back on again. And if you do, then it's a problem. New Mishnah. Koshlim nima b'mikdash avalo b'medina. In the temple, there were harps. So if you want to tie the strings of a harp, you can do this, but not in the Medina, not outside the temple. But that's only if it ripped on Shabbat. But in betchila, if you have a base of a harp and you want to start tying strings on Shabbat, kan v'kan asur. Even in the temple, you're not allowed to do that because shvut in the mikdash, it's allowed. Now, this is true. This is for the avoda because they would play music when they brought the sacrifices. But it's only if it's something that you needed to do specifically today, but this could have been done yesterday. So we don't allow it. Uriminu, but there seems to be a contradiction. Nimat kinor shenifsaka, lo haya koshcha ela onva. If a string of the harp broke, you wouldn't tie it. You wouldn't tie it with a knot. You would do aniva. Remember, we saw there was a difference between tying it and tying it like a bow. So you can't tie it. Okay, if it tears, you can't tie it in a normal way. You can only make a bow out of it. So, and our Mishnah seems to say koshlim, as if regular knot is fine. So lokashya harabanan harab Eliezer. It must be a machloket. One source holds like the rabbis. One source holds like Rabbi Eliezer. The Rabbi Eliezer damar. So what machloket are we talking about? Machshirei mitzvah dochin et hashabbat koshra. The Rabbanan da'amrei ein dochin onva. It all depends whether you hold that things that are facilitating a mitzvah. So to tie the harp is to allow you to do the mitzvah. It doesn't have to do with the mitzvah itself. It's just preparatory work to be able to do the mitzvah. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, machshirei mitzvah do push off the Shabbat. This is like if you have to sharpen a knife in order to use it for a Brit Milah. Is that allowed? Or bring the knife to the Brit Milah. Things like that. So machshirei mitzvah, according to Rabbi Eliezer, override Shabbat. But according to the rabbis, they don't. So if you say they override Shabbat, that's our Mishnah. You can tie it. If you say they don't override Shabbat, then you can only tie it with like a bow. But the Gemara says, wait a minute. If you say, according to Rabbi Eliezer, that you could machshirei mitzvah dochin et Shabbat, then even if you never tied the strings on, you should be allowed to tie the strings on because again, it's machshirei mitzvah. It's allowing you to perform the mitzvah. Ela lo kashya harabi Yehuda harabanan. So they say in the end, it must be that it's a different debate. It's Rabbi Yehuda who says, now we saw this before, that aniva is the same as kshira, meaning aniva is forbidden. If aniva is forbidden, and yet we allow you to tie, and there's no other way to tie other than a forbidden manner, then we're going to allow you to do it. But according to the rabbis, even though both of them hold like Rabbi Eliezer, the rabbis say, no, aniva is not the same as kshira. Kshira is asur. Aniva is allowed. Now, what about this harp? If we say machshirei mitzvah dochin et Shabbat, you should be allowed even to tie it. But come the rabbis and they say, look, it's true you can tie it, but since you have a better way to do it, which isn't forbidden, better to do that than to do what's forbidden by the Torah. So whereas Rabbi Yehuda doesn't have that option because he doesn't think you're allowed, thinks aniva is also forbidden, and therefore aniva or kshira would be allowed. Okay, and that explains the debate between them. Although we're going to reject this also, but we'll get to that tomorrow. Have a great day, everybody, and don't forget to register for the seal.